All right, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20, and welcome to what is sadly, tragically, apocalyptically, our final lecture. Here, in our final lecture, we're going to turn our attention to, again, a part of the world that we have hitherto neglected and try to fill in your knowledge in regards to this part of the world as we examine Southwest Asia in the second half of the 20th century. Now, whenever I use the term Southwest Asia, people look at me and go, "What the hell are you talking about, PhD boy?" Because, unfortunately, and for reasons that I hope to illuminate in this lecture, that term Southwest Asia has not caught on in our common parlance. Instead, we still refer to this part of the world as the Middle East. And so I'll probably use both terms in this lecture, though I greatly prefer Southwest Asia, as it's a way of, again, beating back the Eurocentrism that has so influenced the study of world history for so long. But again, the term Middle East seems to be much more common even in our efforts to move against Eurocentrism in how we think of the world. So in this lecture, we're examining that part of the world, the Middle East, Southwest Asia. We'll be examining developments in that part of the world in the second half of the 20th century. We will offer a few case studies here of developments in that part of the world in an effort to not only fill in this lacuna in your understanding by addressing a part of the world that we have, again, neglected up to this point, but also hopefully helping you understand some contemporary events in this part of the world now in the 21st century. So this is, sadly, tragically, apocalyptically, our final lecture, and in this final lecture we'll take a look at the history of Southwest Asia in the second half of the 20th century. So one last time, history fans, buckle up, here we go. All right, let's begin our look at the contemporary Middle East, or the history of Southwest Asia since 1945, with the story of Israel and Palestine. And to do that, we need to back up a little bit and return to some ideas and insights we did develop earlier in the class in regards to this part of the world. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, one of these big, sprawling, traditional societies, monarchies in this part of the world, was carved up. The Ottoman Empire was one of the nations involved in World War I. Earlier in the class, I made a terrible joke, and you all suffered and survived that joke. We return to it here as we note that the Ottoman Empire was one of the nations involved in World War I on the side of the Central Powers. But it was a big, sprawling empire that had within its domain a number of different nationalist groups that were fighting for a nation of their own. If you've ever seen Lawrence of Arabia, that's that story, the story of T.E. Lawrence, a British soldier who sided with the aspirations of Arab nationalists in the Ottoman Empire who were aspiring to a nation of their own, seeking their own effort against the Ottoman Empire. Remember, nationalism is a contagion in the early 20th century. It is a contagion that spreads around the world, and just like it was active in the Philippines and Cuba and Serbia and Vietnam, it was also active in parts of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire gets involved in World War I, but at the time in the Ottoman Empire, as part of World War I and its efforts to pursue that war, it was vulnerable to attacks from within by these nationalist groups who were again aspiring to create a nation of their own. But at the end of World War I, you would not see modern nation states emerge out of these efforts driven by these nationalist movements when the Ottoman Empire was carved up. Instead, that process took place in Paris at the Paris Peace Conference. This too is an insight we developed earlier in the class, and it's a key insight to return to here as we attempt to make sense of modern Southwest Asia. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, as the Ottoman Empire was being dismantled, rather than allow the people in that part of the world to form their own nation, in the spirit of self-determination that seemed to be in the air at the Paris Peace Conference when new nations like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria and Hungary were created in Europe, instead of that self-determination for Arab people in this region, Great Britain and France pulled out a map of Southwest Asia and began to arbitrarily draw lines saying, you get that part, I get that part. They created what they called mandates. But in reality, they were colonies of Great Britain and France. So the Ottoman Empire is dismantled. But in its demise, in its wake, you would not see the formation of independent nation states created by people in this region. Instead, you'd see this form of European colonialism, where Great Britain and France carve up this area, and Great Britain makes claim to a region known as Palestine along the Mediterranean coast. They would create the fiction that is Iraq, and earlier in the class I talked about how Iraq doesn't really exist as a nation state. It was created by Great Britain and France, clustering together people who are again denied self-determination and nationalism. And that helps you understand what's going on in Iraq today, where you have this fractious nation that really isn't united because it was denied a chance to organically form a union in the way in which many other nation states have been allowed to do so. Also, Great Britain would continue its claims to Egypt, a claim that goes back prior to World War I. Those would be the mandates for Great Britain, basically colonies, areas of the old Ottoman Empire now carved up by the British and ostensibly under British command and control, whereas France would make claims to Lebanon and Syria. And we also talked about how the current crisis in Syria, the civil war in Syria, again, has its roots in this mandate system. But when Great Britain made its claims to Palestine, one of the mandates it created, it declared that it intends at some point, undeclared, unclear, but at some point, to turn that mandate into a Jewish state, into a place where the victims of the Jewish diaspora, the way in which people of that faith have been driven out of that region that they have a historic and religious claim to, could return. And so this is the origins of the modern state of Israel. It goes back to this declaration by Great Britain in this process during World War I and after of creating Palestine to eventually create a Jewish homeland that will allow the victims of persecution, the victims of the diaspora that purged Jewish people from this region to return and create their own nation state. In the decades that followed World War I and before World War II, in the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, that aspiration to a nation state that we talked about with World War I, the efforts of Arab-speaking people in this region to war against the Ottoman Empire, now turned their nationalist aspirations against these efforts by France and Great Britain to colonize this region, against the mandate system. So nationalism is a contagion. It's spreading around the world. People around the world want a nation of their own. And so the Arab nationalists who had been fighting against the Ottoman Empire now were fighting against this effort by France and Great Britain to exact control over this region. Why is France and Great Britain so dedicated to exacting control over this region? Well, part of it is their hubris, their belief in their superiority that's driving their entire empire around the world, the French Empire, the British Empire, colonialism. The imperatives and drives that we talked about earlier in the class are certainly active here in this idea that Great Britain and France rule this region rather than the people there. So part of this, again, is really knowable and identifiable to us because we've learned about the history of European and American colonialism in this class. This idea that we are superior, that you don't deserve to govern yourselves, that we're on some sort of civilizing mission in this region. We've seen that in Latin America, Africa, Asia in this class. And that's part of the reason why Europeans are working to suppress nationalism in this region. But remember also, colonialism has an economic origin. And there's a certain resource in this part of the world that is vital to the global economy, particularly in the early 20th century, oil. And so Europeans wanted to control this region to extract oil for their own benefit and control the global market for that asset. And so there's this deliberate effort to suppress rising Arab nationalism. But as we've also learned in this class, it's very difficult to suppress nationalism because it is such a powerful force in the 20th century. And so this is a time of efforts by Europeans, like they are doing around the world, to suppress the efforts of people in the region to create a nation of their own. And then you have World War II. And in World War II, Germany would attack and occupy this region, also seeking to control those oil reserves that are so key to Germany's aspirations to be a great global power in World War II. The Soviets would invade the region to purge the region of German occupation. That's the story, again, of World War II. And you'd have, as a result of that, some of the early conflicts of the Cold War that we talked about in our lectures on the Cold War era, where the United States and Great Britain are working really hard to roll back Soviet occupation because it's all about the oil in this region. So World War II intervenes and colors and influences the history of this region in that way. When World War II ends, there's a deliberate effort by the British and the United States to purge Soviet control over this region. And then there is the long-standing deep aspirations of Arab-speaking people in this region to finally be able to create nations of their own. They were denied that at the end of World War I. They are determined to make sure at the end of World War II that their goals and aspirations to be able to govern themselves without European and American influence will finally prevail. The Arab League forms. It is the voice of Arab nationalists in this region who are hoping now, after World War II, in an age where France and Great Britain are in decline, when they are soon to lose their empires around the world, in a period where decolonization will soon bloom around the world, that they can finally be able to govern themselves. Now, there is no unanimity in this group of Arab nationalists. Some of them wanted to restore traditional societies, monarchies, like we saw under the Ottoman Empire. Others were liberals who wanted to create modern nation states with republican forms of government, constitutions. And so there are different visions of what an independent nation state will be in this part of the world. But there is this strong and historically rooted effort to be able to create a nation of our own, free of outside interference from Europe or the United States. All right, let's explain how all this plays out in the history of the creation of the modern nation state of Israel and the Palestinian question. In 1945, at the end of World War II, Jewish people from around the world immigrated back to this region to help in the process of creating a modern nation state of Israel. This was a function of what they saw as a very long deferred dream, but also a long deferred promise that came from the Balfour Declaration. When Great Britain took claim to this region, they declared that eventually, whenever they're ready, they will create a Jewish homeland, a Jewish state in this region. World War II displaced many Jewish people who were refugees who fled the rising anti-Semitism and then the efforts of the Germans in World War II and the Holocaust. And so they hoped to return to this homeland. They hoped to return to a region that they have long historic religious claims to and be able to form a nation of their own, self-determination, safety and security for the Jewish people. That imperative was at its height in 1945 at the end of World War II when humanity saw with its own eyes the horrors of the Holocaust, how Germany attempted to exterminate this people in the Holocaust. And so for the Jewish people who had suffered so much for thousands of years, persecution, the Jewish diaspora, their forced fleeing from this region, the persecution and discrimination that they encountered around the world as they fled this region, now is the time to create a Jewish state. Great Britain promised this. It's the end of World War II. And there's this great hope for people around the world for self-determination that will lead to the wave of decolonization that we've talked about in recent lectures. It's the end of World War II, and it's the end of the Holocaust, where Germany attempted to exterminate all Jewish people. So they had survived and lived through this terrible, dark moment as part of a long, terrible history of persecution, which clearly demonstrated the need for a Jewish homeland, the need for safety, security, self-determination for a people who had been forced out of this region for thousands of years, who had found themselves around the globe in this diaspora, and wherever they went, they were subject to anti-Semitism, discrimination, persecution, and the most glaring, galling, and atrocious example of that was the Holocaust, where there was a deliberate effort by a nation, Germany, to absolutely exterminate an entire group of people. And that group of people said, now we need to make sure this never happens again. And the way to do that is to fulfill this promise and create a modern nation state out of the British Mandate. And so Jewish people pour into this region hoping to realize that, to realize a Jewish state, to return to a part of the world that they have a history and religious claim to, and in the aftermath of the Holocaust, create a solution, a remedy to this long history of persecution, a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland that will offer what has been steadily denied to Jewish people for thousands of years, safety, security, and self-determination. However, there were Arab-speaking people in this region who had aspirations of their own for self-determination, and they too, for a long period, had been subject to persecution, discrimination, and steadfast denial of their claims to self-determination. Think about what we've talked about so far in this lecture. Arab-speaking people in this region warred against the Ottoman Empire, seeking sovereignty, independence, a nation of their own. Then at the end of World War I, here come the British, and now they are steadfastly denying Arab-speaking people in this region self-determination. The Jewish people have a historical religious claim to this region. They have suffered thousands of years of persecution. They have been forced out of this homeland. Wherever they went, they were further persecuted. Jewish people fled this region. They came to the United States. There's a very long history of members of the Jewish faith in the United States going back to the very origins of the United States. But that history of Jewish Americans is a history of persecution, discrimination. So the diaspora was necessitated by persecution in this region, and then wherever Jewish people went, they were further persecuted and discriminated against. And of course, the example par excellence of that was the Holocaust, the effort to exterminate these people. So they have suffered so much. And they have been promised by the British that now they can create their own independent state that will meet their demands for self-determination and their righteous claims to safety and security. But again, there are Arab-speaking people, Muslim people in this region who also have a religious claim to this region. So many of the holy sites in Islam also located in this region. They also have a history of being denied self-determination, from Ottoman oppression to European colonialism. They argue if this is about redemption, restoration for the Holocaust, and safety and security for the Jewish people who are subject to that atrocity, we, the Arab-speaking people of this region, weren't responsible for the Holocaust. Why doesn't Germany give up half of its territory to create a Jewish homeland in Europe? Well, of course, that isn't really feasible because the Jewish people identify with this region as their homeland, but the point is a very salient and important one. Why are we, the Arab-speaking people of this region, the members of the Islamic faith of this region, being denied a homeland and self-determination when the Holocaust was a European problem. We're not culpable in the Holocaust, and so why are we facing this potential threat to our aspirations to control this region? In 1947, a plan was established in the newly formed United Nations to create two nation states, Israel and Palestine. This was the partition plan. It was agreed upon at the United Nations as a way to satisfy the righteous demands of both people in this region. So there was a mandate of a certain element here from the United Nations to create two states. Great Britain pulls out in 1948 and leaves behind the people in this region to sort this out. This is, again, something we've seen earlier in previous lectures in regards to Great Britain. They pull out of India in a very similar way and leave behind no plan, no execution of how to create two separate sovereign states, no feasible plan to make such settlements possible. Instead, they leave. And leave India, leave Nigeria, another example of this in a recent lecture, and do so in a way that creates uncertainty in this region. They claimed this region. They said at the end of World War I, the Paris Peace Conference, Palestine is ours. We exact a mandate over this. We take responsibility for this region. We want to because we're so worried about this region and the oil reserves, and we want to make sure we can pump out oil and British Petroleum and others can profit. So Great Britain made a claim to this region, took responsibility for this region, profited from this region. But when it comes time to settle this region after British rule, Great Britain is vacant. Great Britain is absent. And so they pull out, and Jewish leaders in this region, as part of now so much mandate from the Balfour Declaration to the partition plan in a legal sense, but also what we've talked about earlier, the religious claims to this region, the historic claims to this region, this long history of persecution, discrimination capped by the evils of the Holocaust. We have a right to exist. We have a right to self-determination. We have a right to a Jewish state. They declare that Jewish state. But Arab nations in this region, fearing this creation of an Israel and what it means for the region and what it means for Islamic people in this region, Arab-speaking people in this region, attack Israel. And you have the first of many wars in the second half of the 20th century between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In 1948, after Israel declares itself an independent nation, you have the Arab-Israeli War, where Arab nations in the region attack Israel. Israel wins the war, and as part of that, makes claims to territory that were earmarked, demarcated for the Palestinians in that partition plan. Israel responds to this by saying, we have a right to control these territories because when we existed for a nanosecond, the first thing that happened was we were attacked. Now remember, part of the Jewish claim to this region is, again, a long history of persecution, attacks, denial, self-determination. And when Israel was created as an independent state for the first time, finally securing that vision, that possibility, the opportunity of a Jewish state in this region, a chance for Jewish people who have been persecuted around the world to return to their homeland. The first thing that happened when that state was created, they were attacked. So they say we have, again, a right to safety, security. We have a right to self-determination. We were attacked immediately upon the creation of this state. And so we have a right to occupy these territories as part of that safety and security. But of course, that denies the claims of self-determination to the Arab-speaking people, the Muslim people in this region. And there you have the origins of this ongoing conflict that spans through today. There would be many wars in this region between Israel and Arab nations. There are parts of territory that are claimed and occupied by the Israelis to this day, that Palestinians see as their homeland, their state. There have been efforts for many, many decades now, spearheaded by the United States and American administrations, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, to create a two-state solution where there are clearly two nation states created with defined borders. But of course, those efforts have yet to truly come to a solution. And so this problem persists to this day. But hopefully, this class and this lecture are a way for you to understand this contemporary conflict in historical light. Because so much of the way we Americans are often urged to think about this conflict ignores history. We are here in our final lecture wrapping up the class. And one of the goals of this class is to get you to see the world of the 21st century in a historical light. Because there are so many ways in which, particularly we Americans in our media culture, are urged to see the problems around the world without history, without a sense of historicity, the way in which contemporary problems are rooted in history. So much of the media coverage of this region is always about religion. Oh, it's all about religion. These people are warring against religion. And that creates not only a lazy and sloppy way of thinking of the world, but a very dismissive one that seems to indicate, well, we have no role here, no responsibility, and there is no historicity to this. This is a point I made in previous lectures about how we often imagine Africa, parts of Asia, that this is something about these people and their religion and their culture and their ontology, as if there is no history to these conflicts. History is the antidote for bullshit. If you know history, you don't have to eat bullshit anymore. And there's a lot of bullshit in the media coverage, in our public culture in regards to these parts of the world. That's often sloppy, lazy, and dismissive, and not cognizant of historicity. When you think about these regions, you need to think about the history of these regions. The problems in these parts of the world are not a product of religious traditions and the ontology of these people in these different parts of the world. They're a direct result of history, and more pointedly, the history of European and American colonialism in these regions. What we have here in the story of Israel and Palestine is really the consequences of British colonialism in this region. Great Britain takes responsibility for this region and then throws up its hands and walks away, and then tries to indicate that, well, the problem is those people in that region. Think about what we've said previously about the story of modern Africa, modern South Asia. The conflicts in those regions, like the conflicts in Southwest Asia, originate in colonialism. They are the legacies of colonialism. They are not a product of thousands of years of religious difference. That's an ontological, dismissive, essentialist way of thinking about the world. History is the antidote to that. It urges you to think about the world as the product of historical circumstances, consequences, and decisions. How history shapes the contemporary reality. That the contemporary reality is a product of, again, historical developments, not ontological, essential elements of the people around the world. Modern Africa is a product of European colonialism. And the modern Middle East is a product also of European colonialism, including the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine. So the next time you see in our modern media culture this idea that's all about religion, again, history is the antidote for that. Alrighty, let's now turn our attention to the next case study example of the modern Middle East, modern Southwest Asia, Egypt, and talk about the origins of the modern Egyptian state. Now, that part of North Africa had long been part of the British Empire going back to the 19th century. So before the mandate system in World War I, Great Britain had already made claims to this region. But at the end of World War II, for all the reasons we've been talking about, the decline of Great Britain and the continuing efforts of nationalists within the British and French and American empires for independence, Great Britain agreed to relinquish its claims to Egypt. Egypt would emerge as a modern nation state in 1952. So, decolonization. In 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser assumed the presidency of this independent modern Egyptian state. And the story of Nasser's presidency really exemplifies how independent states in this era of decolonization in Africa, Asia, Latin America really experienced a fate that was deeply influenced by the other major development in global history in this period after World War II, the Cold War. Because Nasser attempted to be independent in this rivalry. We've talked in previous lectures how the Soviet Union is attempting to expand its influence around the globe. It sees communism as the way forward for humanity. It's deeply invested in exerting its influence around the globe. It's building up a large military. It sends its own cultural ambassadors around the globe, believing in the superiority of Soviet culture. And of course, the United States is likewise, in the containment period, deeply committed to not only containing the spread of communism, but integrating nations around the world into our global system of capitalism. And so we send Peace Corps volunteers and Harlem Globetrotters around the globe as well. There's a very famous tour of black jazz musicians who traveled the Middle East in the early Cold War period, including the great American Louis Armstrong, who is not only a great American musician, but is one of the most important Americans of the 20th century in so many ways. And there's a really interesting book about this written by historian Penny von Aschen, which is titled Satchmo Travels the World, something like that. Satchmo was the nickname of Louis Armstrong. The very famous photograph that appears on the cover of that book of Louis Armstrong playing his trumpet in front of the Sphinx, the landmark there in Egypt. So the United States is sending cultural ambassadors around the globe. Soviet Union is, and Nasser attempts to play the two off each other in an effort of true sovereignty. He realized that if you emerge out of colonialism, in this case British colonialism, and then you just yoke your fate to one of these two sides, you're really not independent. You become captive to your alliance with the United States, captive to your alliance with the Soviet Union. Nasser was briefly very adroit at playing the two powers against each other, trying to win concessions from both. He realized that both sides are seeking influence in this region, the United States and Egypt, so they send Louis Armstrong and others, Soviets. And the best way to do this, to maintain Egyptian sovereignty, is not commit to either side, try to play the two sides against each other, win concessions from both. But remember, the United States in the containment era says you're either with us or you're with the Soviets. Black and white, Manichaean, absolute. And they don't like Nasser entertaining concessions from the Soviet Union. So Nasser tries this, but it's really hard because both sides demand absolute allegiance to their respective sides. So that's what I meant by Nasser's presidency really reveals the hazards of independent states in this period trying to forge what was known as a third way, not cleaving towards free market capitalism and the American system, but also not cleaving towards command economy communism as demanded by the Soviet Union. Nasser was a nationalist. He wanted to protect the sovereignty of the Egyptian state. The Egyptians had fought for so long to be independent of British rule, and the best way forward was to create an Egypt for the Egyptians rather than trying to again fit into this Cold War framework established by the United States and the Soviet Union. And to that end, in 1956, Nasser nationalized Egyptian control over the Suez Canal. This is very exemplary of his nationalism. This is a global asset. This is something really, really valuable, as the Suez Canal links Europe to Asia, links the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, allows traffic to flow from Asia into Europe and back. And therefore, this really valuable asset here in Egypt should profit Egypt. Suez Canal was built by the British in the 19th century, and though the British left Egypt, they wanted to retain control over the Suez Canal, much like the United States leaves Panama in the mid-20th century, but would control the Panama Canal until the late 20th century. The British say, we built this, it's ours, and therefore we have a right to control it. And so, yeah, Egypt, you're going to be independent and sovereign, but we're going to keep this really, really important part of Egyptian territory as our own. Nasser says, no, 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 no. For so long, you British have controlled Egypt, profited from our resources, whether it's oil or this geographic asset and resource, the way in which Egypt links Europe to Asia, plays a key role in global commerce and transportation, the Suez Canal. You've profited from that for a century. Now it's ours. So this is the idea that things in Egypt should profit Egyptians, independence, sovereignty. Well, Great Britain doesn't like losing the Suez Canal, and so they form a coalition of themselves, France, which is also really worried about Egypt controlling the Suez Canal rather than their ally, Great Britain, and Israel, the newly formed state that also is a bit concerned about, again, Arab nationalism for reasons that we talked about in the previous slide, also fears Egyptian control of this vital global asset. And this coalition of Israel, France, and Great Britain attack Egypt, trying to wrest back control of the Suez Canal. So now we have a conflict between Egyptian nationalism, Egyptian aspirations for independence, Nasser's imperative to do something that will profit the Egyptian people, and these nation states that have various concerns about that Egyptian independence and nationalism. Now, these three nations, Israel, France, and Great Britain, in 1956, in this event known as the Suez Crisis, are all allies of the United States. It is the early Cold War period. It is the containment era. It's the period of, the Berlin airlift, and soon after the Korean War. I mean, we're really at the zenith of containment. And as part of containment, we had an alliance with Great Britain and France in an effort to combat the spread of communism around the globe. We were trying to, in French colonies like Vietnam, suppress independence and side with the French. So by every measure, the United States is working very close with Great Britain and France after World War II as part of the Cold War. And the United States had an alliance with Israel as well in the early Cold War period as we tried to combat communist influence in Southwest Asia. So these three nations, Israel, France, and Great Britain, all have their reasons for attacking Egypt and trying to wrest back control of the Suez Canal, but they're all also allies of the United States in this larger context of the Cold War. And as a result, you would assume that the United States in this period, so interventionist, so committed to being a great global power, seeing the 20th century as the American century, would side with its allies. But that's not what happens. In 1956, the United States intervenes in what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine and sided with the Egyptians, put pressure on our allies, Israel, France, and Great Britain, to back down. Why? Because rather than Israel, France, and Great Britain, the United States wanted to be the great power in this region. So we side with the Egyptians, not because all of a sudden the United States is this great supporter of Arab nationalism, but because we don't want Great Britain, France, and Israel taking advantages to assert their control over the region. What the Eisenhower Doctrine seemed to indicate was the United States was now determined to influence this part of the world. And so this brings in a really key element, not just of Egyptian history and this crucial event in the midpoint of the 20th century, the Suez Crisis, but another key factor in understanding the history of the modern Middle East. After 1945, the United States is determined to be the great influence in this region. In the Cold War, it's making sure the Soviets don't influence this region. In the 20th century, it's again about the flow of a vital resource out of this region, oil. And now in the 21st century, it remains in many ways about American influence in this region in the residue and aftermath of the Cold War, and beginning in 2001 in the framework of the global war against terrorism. So the United States remains deeply invested in influencing this part of the world. That's the contemporary reality, and its origins come here to the Eisenhower Doctrine. What the Eisenhower Doctrine enunciated was the idea that we, the United States, want to help Arab nation states in this region, provided they're on our side of the Cold War. What the United States sees in this opportunity is to bring Egypt closer to the United States and away from the Soviets. So we're going to help you nationalize and control the Suez Canal, not because we're so enthusiastic about Egyptian nationalism, but we know that if you side with us, the global flow of oil will continue. And if you side with us, we win again in this contest of wills against the Soviet Union. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is not the United States here in some fashion becoming deeply committed to Arab nationalism. Instead, the Eisenhower Doctrine is about thwarting the efforts of Great Britain, France, and Israel to influence this region, as well as a Cold War imperative against the Soviet Union. That means the United States must be the great power in this region. And as long as you side with us, we're going to be on your side, Arab nationalists. As long as you side with us, we're going to support Egypt. So you have the Eisenhower Doctrine. You have the United States basically declaring the Middle East is ours to influence and prefigure. And this explains the origins, some of which we'll talk about in events here in a moment in places like Iran, of American influence in this region that again continues to this very day. And it indicates again how even after modern independent nation states are created in this region, they are subject to outside influence. Prior to 1945, it's European influence. After 1945, it's American influence in this region. And the Suez Crisis and the Eisenhower Doctrine is very demonstrative of that. When France, Great Britain, and Israel seem to intervene in this region, despite our alliances with those countries, we come and say, no, 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 no. We're going to side with the Egyptians as a way of bringing them closer to the United States and establishing the United States, not Israel, France, and Great Britain, as the great influence in this region. Under the Eisenhower Doctrine, the United States said, we're going to help independent nation states in North Africa and the Middle East. We're going to side with those states in an effort to bring them into our side of the Cold War. We have to do so because, again, every scrap of land is in contest, every square inch around the globe is up for grabs, and we're not going to abide any advances for communism in this region. But of course, with it comes America's commitment to this part of the world in which we see ourselves as now rightfully able to intervene. And the United States has steadfastly intervened in this region for the last 80 years. So this too needs to be accounted for in our story of the modern Middle East. That when European colonialism ends, we don't have independent nation states that can pursue a path of their own making. That history of an independent nation state, like in Israel, is deeply influenced by context, the context of the Cold War and the ongoing commitment of the United States that says the Middle East, that's our domain. The Middle East, a lot of oil there, and if we don't claim it, the Soviets will. So we, the United States, are going to intervene, and we're going to actively support those nation states in that region, as witnessed by this effort to suppress France, Great Britain, Israel to reclaim the Suez Canal, as long as those states are on our side. So this is a crucial moment that introduces the role of the United States in shaping the modern Middle East. Let's take a deeper dive in this slide into relations between these two nations that we've now described that emerge as nation states in the second half of the 20th century, Egypt and Israel. In 1967, these two nations would go to war. Israel, fearing an attack from Egypt, preemptively attacked Egypt, and it led to a Six-Day War, which was a victory for Israel. Israel defeats Egypt, and as part of that, makes its claims to the Sinai Peninsula, that area of land where the Suez Canal is established, that area of land between Egypt and the larger Middle East. The Sinai Peninsula is this region between these two countries. It was claimed by Egypt as part of their nation and part of their claims to the Suez Canal. But as part of Israel's victory, they would come to occupy and control that key strip of land. And in 1973, Egypt would try to wrest back control of the most crucial and profitable part of the Sinai Peninsula, the canal itself. And this creates, again, great friction, but also great opportunity between the two nations to reconcile the consequences of the Six-Day War and who has a legitimate claim to the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal. For Egypt, this is our land. Israel claimed it, again, as a product of its victory in the Six-Day War. But to ratchet down hostility to the two nations, Israel should return that land to Egypt. In 1977, the negotiations reached a greater intensification. The leader of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, went and visited Israel. And this was a landmark event because up until this point, leaders of Arab nations refused to engage in diplomacy with Israel, refused to recognize Israel, often again in relation to their sympathy and support for Palestinians, Arab-speaking people in the territories occupied by Israel as a result of the 1948 conflict. This was an effort by Sadat to open relations with Israel and, again, ratchet down the hostility, create some sort of solution to the question regarding the Sinai Peninsula and Egyptian claims to it and clear sovereignty over the Suez Canal. So diplomacy now being pursued by these two nations, but it's a very fraught effort because, as I said, previous to this, Egyptian governments refused to recognize Israel, to even recognize it as a state. And as we've documented throughout this lecture, there's of course a great deal of hostility between Arab nations and Israel, a cycle of wars, with the Six-Day War being the most recent. Eventually, the United States intervenes because, remember, as we've also talked about, the United States sees this part of the world as theirs to influence, orchestrate, and manipulate. And the Carter administration, James Carter, Jimmy Carter, is elected president in 1976, and he inherits the détente policy that Nixon created, but tried to expand it in certain key ways. In particular, advocating for human rights around the globe, ending or diminishing American support for a lot of dictators that we were supporting in the Cold War that certainly were threats to American ideals. The Carter administration had a very idealistic foreign policy that wanted to see the United States as a good actor around the globe rather than simply, again, following the logic of containment. But as part of that, the United States continued this idea that we are going to influence the global order, albeit more so in line with the imperatives of the Carter administration. And so Carter pursues relations between Egypt and Israel and wants to play a key role as a power broker between the two. And the product of this was something known as the Camp David Accords. Camp David is this famous presidential retreat. And Carter invites the leaders of Israel and Egypt to come to the United States, neutral territory, in gorgeous Camp David, and hammer out a peace agreement that would see the Sinai Peninsula return to Egypt in concession to Egypt recognizing Israel as a state and signing a peace treaty that hopes to prevent future conflict. So it's diplomacy, it's the United States putting itself at the center of this effort, literally putting it within the United States. But it's an effort to reconcile this problem that, again, comes not just from the Six-Day War in 1967, but the creation of these two nation states. One, a majority Arab-speaking Muslim nation, Egypt, and its neighbor, Israel, majority Jewish, Hebrew-speaking population. 1979, this event, the Camp David Accords, was one that brimmed with hope and optimism, that diplomacy could prevail, that nations in this region could work together, again, towards the goal of ratcheting down conflict, hostility, and towards greater stability. It was reflective of what Carter saw as the potential of the United States to indeed be a good actor around the globe. And so Camp David Accords are signed, Egypt gets the Sinai Peninsula back, and Egypt recognizes Israel as a legitimate state and now signs a treaty, hopefully pursuing peaceful relations between the two. But 2 years later, Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt and responsible for the Accords, is assassinated by an Arab nationalist because he recognized Israel. Sadat is seen as a traitor among the most ardent nationalists for daring to enter diplomacy, agreement, and concessions to Israel. People refuse to accept. These very intense Arab nationalists refuse to accept what Sadat had done, and he's killed. And this is now the pin in the balloon. This crushes all that optimism that the Camp David Accords seemed to augur, that diplomacy could prevail, that you could have peaceful coexistence between Arab states and Israel in the Middle East. When Sadat pursued that, he was rewarded with a bullet. He was killed. This, therefore, seems to really jeopardize diplomacy and also really chastens the efforts of Egyptians towards relations with Israel, emboldens nationalists within Egypt. Why pursue friendly relations with Israel if it's going to end in your assassination? So the assassination of Sadat is a very tragic turn in the history of the modern Middle East and relations between Israel and Egypt. In the years that followed, nationalists in Egypt would have greater sway, greater influence. Those who pursued the diplomatic line that Sadat had pursued are fearful of doing so in what happened. And as a result, relations deteriorate between Egypt and Israel. Nationalists in the region and from Egypt continue to support Palestinian efforts against the Israeli occupation of territories that the Palestinians see as rightfully theirs, going back to that partition plan, and Palestinians fight against that occupation in something known as the Intifada. And many nationalists in the region, including those from Egypt, support Palestinians in that effort, cleaving towards, again, what they see as a commonality of purpose with the Palestinians. And this is added to the conflict in Israel and Palestine to this day. So the great hopes of, again, greater relations and stability between Egypt and Israel ultimately devolve in this terrible and tragic and ongoing fashion. Let's continue our case study examples of developments in the modern Middle East by now turning our attention to Iran and Iraq. Let's begin with the story of the modern nation state of Iran, which would emerge in the second half of the 20th century. And in 1953, in Iran, a president would be elected through a democratic election named Mohammad Mosaddegh. Mosaddegh was a nationalist, and like Nasser in Egypt, believed that the assets of this nation, in this case Iran, should benefit the Iranian people. For too long, these assets have been under the demand and control of foreigners, namely Europeans, who have extracted oil and other wealth from this region for their own benefit. Like the Suez Canal should profit the people of Egypt, Mossadegh believed that the oil in Iran should profit the Iranian people. And so he moved to nationalize the oil fields in Iran. Basically take control of these oil fields that were claimed by European and American oil companies for the Iranian nation to the benefit of the Iranian people. Well, this happens early in the Cold War period, early in the containment period. We've already talked about how in many ways the first conflict of the Cold War took place in Iran, in this jousting between the Soviets and the United States and Great Britain, as Great Britain and the United States put pressure on the Soviets to exit this region. So it's already at the very end of World War II a hotbed of Cold War concerns and imperatives. And so the United States is deeply committed to influence this region, and it sees Mossadegh as someone who is a communist because he's declaring a nationalization of the oil fields and seizing private property. And so at the height of the early Cold War period, the United States says we can't allow Mohammad Mossadegh to be the legitimate ruler of Iran, despite the fact that he was democratically elected. Remember, in the Cold War, we claimed to be ambassadors of democracy around the world as long as you vote the way we want you to. The United States is intervening in many parts of the world when individuals are elected that we see as communist or socialist in their orientations. We talked about that in Chile, happens in Guatemala as well, when there's an effort to nationalize land there. What's happening in Iran, very similar. The Iranian people vote for Mossadegh. Mossadegh says, I'm going to help the Iranian people and seize these assets that should benefit the Iranians, but because he's seizing the private property of American and European oil companies, the United States says, you got to go. And the CIA participates in a coup in Iran that takes out Mossadegh and establishes rulership under the Shah, who would come to control Iran with American support for the next 25, 26 years. The Shah was an autocrat. He would rule Iran, no elections. He would repress groups within Iran. The United States supported that because he prevented that nationalization of the oil industry, and he was on our side in the Cold War. So here is the American influence in this region. But people in Iran resented the rule of the Shah and the American role in propping up the Shah. The Shah, again, ruled absolutely. This is not a democracy. This is an autocracy, one guy in charge. He was complicit in doing business with outsiders who continued to extract oil wealth from this region for the profit of British Petroleum, Shell, and ConocoPhillips. And he also was very repressive against religious expression in Iran. The Shah saw himself as a modernizer, a secular leader, and in particular, he was trying to prevent movements against him that often were rooted in religious expressions and traditions. So young people in Iran come to hate the Shah because of his ties to foreigners. They see him as a puppet. They see him as responsible for, again, undermining the wealth of the Iranian people. They see him as an autocrat who is suppressing free expression of religion. And from that comes a movement that eventually will overthrow the Shah and establish a new nation state in a new government in Iran, with the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which was led by religious leaders, namely the Ayatollah Khomeini. So 1979, there's a revolution in Iran against the Shah, but really also against American rule in Iran that was, again, propping up the Shah. And here again, we should be mindful of how we often are urged to see this part of the world in a very limited and biased way. For reasons we'll explain in greater depth in just a moment, the American people were urged to see this through the lens of religion because it was led by a religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, because so many of the revolutionaries were committed to this idea of creating an Islamic state in Iran. But of course, seeing it solely about religion fails to see the historicity here. This was also an anti-American, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist action because it was an uprising against the Shah, who was again an American toady, an American puppet. As part of the Iranian Revolution, the supporters of Khomeini, the revolutionaries, seized the symbol of American intervention in Iran, the American embassy in Tehran, and took the American State Department employees hostage in one element of the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian hostage crisis, where 53 American citizens who were members of the State Department, in the eyes of revolutionaries, on the ground, imperialist colonizers or architects of this American foreign policy they objected to, they were held hostage. And for a long time, they were held hostage, well over a year. Images of them appeared in the American media every day. The major news networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC, had a running counter of the days in which these Americans were held hostage. They were represented in the American media as fathers, as sons. There were all these testimonies from their wives and children. They want daddy to come home. They were seen in the American media in blindfolds with young Iranian men next to them holding AK-47s. So this was a very dramatic and traumatic event in America that really changed our perception of the Middle East and began our continuing association with this region and Islam and terrorism. Prior to the Iranian hostage crisis, Americans did not immediately think of this part of the world in relation to Islam and terrorism. What the Iranian hostage crisis does is make that the dominant signifier in the American imagination. Of course, this is amplified in the aftermath of September 11th, but really the very first event that would urge Americans to think about this part of the world as a hotbed of terrorism, Iranian hostage crisis, and the way in which it again was represented in the American imagination. Prior to the Iranian hostage crisis, when Americans saw the Middle East, they didn't think of Islam. They thought first and foremost about oil. For some time, this part of the world was largely framed in the American media as an oil-rich area. That was particularly true in the 70s leading up to the Iranian Revolution, where OPEC, an organization of petroleum exporting countries, most of which are in the Middle East, had cut off the flow of oil. And it led to spikes in gas prices here in the United States. It led to long lines at the pump where people waited for hours to buy a few gallons of gas. Major changes to the American economy, the decline of the American auto industry as Americans scrambled for fuel-efficient Nissans or Datsuns at the time, Hondas, Toyotas, Mazdas, and that led to the decline of Ford and Chevy and American manufacturing. Oh my goodness, there's so many consequences to this. But one of the consequences was now Americans saw the Iranian Revolution through this lens of religiosity and terrorism, whereas previously we thought of this part of the world either through the lens of the Cold War, it's also the Soviets, or through the lens of oil. Jimmy Carter was president at this time, and he had to go on the American television and reveal to the American people that there was a plan to free the hostages. The name of this operation was Operation Eagle Claw, which sounds so bitchin', right? You know, Eagle Claw. The plan was to fly Marine helicopters into Tehran, land at the embassy, storm the embassy, and free the hostages. But sand got in the rotors of the helicopters, and they all crashed. So Carter goes on TV and reveals this. Of course, the American people knew nothing about it. Nobody did. It was a secret plan, right? So the first they heard of it was when it was an absolute disaster. The helicopters crashed, the Marines on board were killed, and we didn't get the hostages. Now, this takes place in 1979, 1980, just a few years after America's defeat in Vietnam. And it seemed to be further evidence that America couldn't achieve its goals around the globe, that America was in decline. It certainly made Carter look weak, inept, and likely played a role in his defeat when he ran for re-election in 1980. But the greater lasting consequence of, again, the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis was to change how Americans thought about the Middle East and usher in this phase that continues to this day, where when Americans think of this part of the world, they think first and foremost about religion and terrorism. But prior to the Iranian Revolution, again, most Americans saw this part of the region in regards to oil because of the oil boycotts, the economic consequences, the decline of the American middle class, 1970s, as a result of the energy shocks and the decline of American auto industry, oil, oil, oil. And then prior to that, Americans saw this part of the world as, again, through the lens of containment and this idea the Soviets want to take over that part of the world. Things change with the Iranian hostage crisis, where Americans now primarily thought this part of the world through the lens of terrorism and religiosity. But again, one of the consequences of this was that it ignored the real origins of the Iranian Revolution. It wasn't about Islam. It was about opposition to American imperialism in Iran that began with removing a democratically elected president, Mohammad Mosaddegh, installing a repressive dictator, and that repressive dictator, with American support, repressing his own people. So again, though Americans would come to think of this part of the world as one of religion, 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 or Islam, 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 here we learn that this is really about the historicity, the background of American intervention in this part of the world. So the Iranian Revolution, like America's defeat in Vietnam, was evidence of how America couldn't necessarily just call in the Marines and get things the way they want. In 1986, there was a movie called Delta Force, starring Chuck Norris, who has, of course, lived on in many, many internet memes. And this was a film, like many films of the Reagan era of the 1980s, of the one-man gang, Rambo, RoboCop, one guy who goes in, kicks ass, and solves all the problems, right? It was very conducive to Reagan-era America, which was about resurrecting myths about individualism and martial power, restoring the idea of American toughness. And so you got movies like Rambo, like RoboCop, many of these one-man gang, one guy with a gun solves all the problem type movies. And Chuck Norris was the king of those movies. And in 1986, he made a movie called Delta Force, which was about a hijacking of a plane by Iranian terrorists who wanted to destroy the state of Israel. Chuck Norris goes in with his companion Lee Marvin, kills all the terrorists, saves all the Americans, and then safely flies the plane to Israel, creating a nice, satisfying ending that Hollywood could orchestrate that could not be orchestrated in reality. So when we can't get our way around the world, when America faces these stubborn problems around the globe, sometimes only Chuck Norris can save us. American relations with Iran and Iran's history in the late 20th century was further complicated by a war between Iran and its neighbor, Iraq, for most of the 1980s. And in this conflict between Iraq and Iran, the United States sided with Iraq and supported the government in Iraq led by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had seized control of Iraq, and because he was an avowed anti-communist, one who did not side with the Soviet Union, he enjoyed great support from the United States, in addition to America's interest in this region and access to oil production. All of this made Saddam Hussein a close ally of the United States in the late 70s and through the 1980s. The Iran-Iraq War was about who would control vital oil fields at the borderlands between the two nations. And so for most of the 1980s, in the latter stage of the Cold War, this war spanned that decade. A lot was at stake. America's support for Saddam Hussein, the global supply of oil, and all of this took place again in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, where the United States had come to now see Iran transformed and a nation that remained hostile to the United States in the aftermath of the deposing of the Shah, the Iranian Revolution, and the Iranian hostage crisis. The United States backed Saddam Hussein, as it had been prior to the conflict, but In the mid-1980s, in the second term for Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra scandal came to life, which illuminated that members of the Reagan administration were secretly selling arms to Iran in order to generate money to fund an anti-communist effort in Nicaragua. This was illegal. The U.S. Congress had passed a law forbidding supporting the Contras, the group in Nicaragua that was fighting against a leftist government there. So to get around that, the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to, dun dun dun, Iran, the nation that had taken our citizens hostage, the nation that had become such an avowed enemy of the United States. All of this done behind the back of Saddam Hussein, the guy we were supposedly supporting. So America, in the end, ended up supporting both sides, and Saddam Hussein felt betrayed, and this played a role later in his aggression against American interest in the region when he invaded Kuwait in late 1990, leading to the first war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, advanced by the United States, what's known as the First Gulf War or the Gulf War. This was the first conflict after the Cold War. One point of significance of the Gulf War is at that point, though it wasn't yet clear the fate of the Soviet Union, it was very clear that international communism was crumbling and a new global age was about to dawn with the falling of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. So by 1990, early 1991, even before the hammer and sickle are lowered over the Kremlin, it's very clear that the Cold War era is ending. And the Gulf War was cited then as the beginning, perhaps, of a new age of American dominance with the decline of the Soviet Union. The Iraq War came when the Gulf War came when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and America invaded Kuwait ostensibly to liberate Kuwait. We did not invade Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein. That, of course, would come later in the invasion that began in 2003. The Gulf War was instead an effort to ostensibly liberate Kuwait, roll back Hussein's aggression, and make sure, again, oil flowed freely from Kuwait and other states in the Persian Gulf region. But it now marked America going to war with Saddam Hussein, who had been previously America's boy in the Middle East, who had long enjoyed American support. But of course, that relationship between Saddam Hussein, which came out of a Cold War imperative to counter Iran, and its support for the Soviet Union, its alliance with the Soviet Union, really broke down when it became clear that the Reagan administration was secretly arming Iran. Another thing that's significant about the Gulf War, it's really the beginning of the cable news era. This conflict really made CNN the most important force in television news because it offered 24-hour coverage. It was a 24-hour cable news network, and Americans were eager to follow the story of the American-led effort against Saddam Hussein, the first Gulf War. The networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, only offered evening news once during the day in the evening for 30 minutes, whereas CNN offered 24-hour news coverage. And so this is also a major shift in American culture, ushering in the sewer that is cable news, and increasingly our ADD culture, where we need to have news constantly on demand. So there are many layers to the Iran-Iraq war, but it certainly demonstrates America's continued commitment to this region, interventionist effort after the Cold War, here now going to war with Saddam Hussein after supporting him, and it shows this growing sort of morass in this period that America can't seem to fix according to its designs and imperatives. You have the Iranian Revolution, you have the Iran-Iraq War, you have the invasion of Iraq, and though this is at the time celebrated as a great victory for the United States, it's really one beat in a longer rhythm that indicates that America may see itself as being able to intervene in this region, but often not necessarily to America's goals and interests
as it remains a very difficult place for the United States to mold and shape to our designs, even now with our continued occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. During the first Gulf War, the United States landed troops in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was our ally in the first Gulf War. And as a result, they lent their nation and their airspace to American efforts. Saudi Arabia was happy to see the United States intervene against their rival Iraq and Saddam Hussein. But the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, in what is identified as the Holy Land of Islam, would be later one of the grievances that Osama bin Laden would cite in explaining his attacks launched on September 11th, 2001, which led to the American invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, the beginning of what still stands as the longest war in American history, the war in Afghanistan, and the ways in which, as I've indicated in previous lectures, we continue to reap the consequences of Cold War actions now in the seemingly post-Cold War period. Let's wrap up here by summarizing some of the themes that we've encountered in this last lecture as we've taken a look at the modern Middle East, the Middle East since 1945, or hopefully, as you will now refer to it, history of Southwest Asia after 1945. I've indicated that what we see here is in many ways the consequences of British and American intervention in this part of the world, as well as the consequences of the Paris Peace Conference. Again, I've tried to stress to you to see this part of the world not through the lens of religion, ontology, dominant signifiers, but instead as a place shaped by history, a history in many ways deepened and prefigured by imperialism in the first half of the 20th century. Also, as I've indicated, that so much of what happens, whether it's relations with Egypt, relations with Iraq, Iran, the coup against Mossadegh, all of this is deeply influenced by the Cold War and America's intervention in this region after 1945. The British and French empires recede, but after 1945, America plays a role in this region, often to our frustration, often evidencing our inability to manipulate this part of the world to our designs, our failure to again approach this part of the world as one as having historicity, one where people here have their own imperatives, and as a result, sometimes the only way we can feel happy is if Chuck Norris makes us feel happy in the fictions of Hollywood. And I also want to note that this is a region of great diversity, and this too pushes against the ways in which Americans are often urged to think of the Middle East as a monolith, as a zone of Islam and terrorism. Each of these nations, whether it's North Africa, in the Middle East, Southwest Asia, the Gulf area, or extending into parts of South Asia like Afghanistan, has a different history, different populations, great disparities within their nations, different forms of government. And so we have to be mindful of, again, the way in which this part of the world is one not just of a certain history, but also one where there are many different ways of being, different forms of governance. Some of these nations are thriving, others continue to be underdeveloped as a result of legacies of imperialism or overcommitment to fossil fuels. And so that too needs to be noted as well. So hopefully this was a good primer to all of you in regards to the modern Middle East. And being that this is our last lecture, let me just conclude by saying I hope you feel the goals of the class have been met, that you've certainly learned a great deal more about the history of humanity over the last 120 years. I also hope that you've been urged here to think of history in a new light. Many of you may never take history again. I understand that. You're a biology major, computer science major. But hopefully this class introduced you at least to the virtues and importance of thinking like a historian, approaching the question of human life here on Earth through the lens of history. And I hope many of you will take other history courses with me or in our department. Our department features many bright professors, many great talented lecturers who can really impart to you some of, again, the things you can only learn in a history class. I hope you also enjoyed the class. I hope we're back on campus soon and we don't have to attend the classes in this virtual manner. I hope I served you well.